here's your finders. Today the paper was due at 12 noon, just as a reminder, in case anybody didn't get it in. Today we're going to talk about American Federal, and this is a magic year in the United States, 1776, and so it's kind of a good year for us to start on because we really can identify with American history because we know so much about what happened in 1776. So this will really tie in for you in terms of design in a particular period. All right. So the neoclassical movement is going on all over the world, in England and France and Italy and Spain, and it first appears in the United States in this period, American Federal, real true neoclassical interpretation of the style. It's based primarily on English modes, and that's, as we talked about before, primarily because most of the immigrants were coming from England, but some were also coming from France. And as you know, we were breaking our ties with England, right? So what you'll see is that most of it is like England, but they're trying to put a twist on it that's American. Okay, so Robert Adam is the most famous interior designer in England at the time, and Robert Adam is also an architect. He does architecture a little bit, but he's primarily an interior designer, and most of the neoclassical American Federal is based on the English model, and with Robert Adam specifically being the most famous designer. And as we said before, the Federal style was to reinforce the emancipation of the United States from England. So the new nation creates a new government, and there are some influences that remain, and those are primarily reinforced by trade and travel. People are going back and forth between England and France and the United States. Actually, it's not the United States yet. And you also have pattern books that we saw before, and we also had carpenters and joiners who were coming from England and France and creating furniture in the New World. So what we have is classical details and ornament. One of the primary characteristics of the style is slender proportions. And you find that in chairs, tables, all types of casework, buildings, and contrasting circular and rectangular shapes. So it's based primarily on an English model with a search for a new American government, and they're looking for really more refined, classic, there's the word right in it, classic Greek and Roman precedents, and the scale of everything in the New World is smaller than in England. Okay, so lots of the furniture, the houses, the buildings. The neoclassical in England is mainly for the royalty. But obviously neoclassical in the New World is for New Americans. So 1776, Declaration of Independence, that's where we're starting today, with that time frame. And we said the new nation needed an official architecture to legitimize the emancipation. The leaders were acquainted with European trends. They advocated for neoclassicism. They modeled it on Greece and Rome and the ancient republics. And they really were proposing the neoclassical style as a national architecture. And that was in large part, I think the French were very helpful, as you might know. Part of the reason the French aristocracy failed was that they were stretched financially so thin because they were actually helping the Americans fight the English here in the New World. And they became so overextended financially that eventually the French monarchy toppled, that what are we going to say about that? Oh, but people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. You can actually see drawings. I think there's some recent movies where they've showed Benjamin Franklin in Paris, or Benjamin Franklin in London, or Thomas Jefferson went to Paris. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson was trying to get money for the new country. And as you know, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. He was also an inventor. He was also an architect. He was also one of the most well-read people in the New Republic. And some little artifacts about Thomas Jefferson you might know is that Thomas Jefferson's library at Monticello became the Library of Congress for the United States. So after the British burned the first library, Thomas Jefferson donated his library, or I think the U.S. paid him $2,000 for all of his thousands and thousands of books, and those became our first American library. Another interesting thing about Thomas Jefferson was when he went to France to borrow all the money for the war, to get the money for the war, he knew he couldn't possibly ever keep up with the French fashions, because as you know, you had Louis XIV, and you had the great big silks and the brocades and the gilded furniture and all those things we saw last time. And so what he did was Thomas Jefferson went to France and he put on what's the name of the Kentucky Boone, Daniel Boone skull cap or whatever, with the tail of the raccoon hanging off the back. And he wore his old shoes, they had some holes in it. And he actually charmed the French because he was trying to dress the part of the New World. And so rather than compete with them and try to be dressed like the French, he decided to go as this typical American outdoorsman, which he really wasn't, to that extent. But the French were just charmed by him, and they said, "Oh, isn't he so charming? He appears in the French court with holes in his shoes, and he's actually so typical of the New World." And they just thought he was charming, and they gave him, thousands and thousands of French francs, and that helped the United States in the War of 1812 with England. Didn't help the French much, but it helped the Americans. So Robert Adam, you mentioned, was the most famous interior designer in England at the time, and his interiors were copied in the New World but interpreted, and the interiors that he was particularly known for were the Capel-White and Sheraton styles. And there were some Louis XVI influences that we looked at last time. So here are some typical motifs from the Federal period, and this is probably the most famous one. You see this on almost all Federal decoration, that is the eagle. And of course that was the symbol of the New Republic, and the reason why is because I believe eagles are native to North America. The original bird for North America was going to be the turkey, because there are no turkeys in Europe, and I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said the turkey wasn't noble, maybe Benjamin Franklin was advocating for the turkey. Some of them were advocating for the turkey, some were advocating for the eagle, and the eagle went out. So you see the eagle lots and lots of times in the furnishings. And of course, Benjamin Franklin and George Washington. And here we see a door with a curved stair. And this is the first time the curved stair is used in the United States. So the curved stair is typical of Federal interiors. And then if you see this marquetry, which is probably the front of a table, this is called wood inlay. I did not bring you an example of wood inlay. I forgot to bring it today, but maybe I'll bring it next time. We'll talk about wood inlay again. But I have some examples of wood inlay for you. Okay. So in architecture, the architecture was mostly domestic, not monumental. There were only very few public buildings, and they were mostly like small cities, small townhouses. And in these townhouses or in the countryside, you have wood frame construction or brick exteriors, depending on whether you're in the south or the north. And as we said, there were no professional architects. It was really gentlemen amateurs or master craftsmen, which sort of was how Thomas Jefferson found his way into it. He was definitely in both of those categories. And they were sort of imitating the European neoclassical And they were not innovative, they were imitative. And I don't know, sometimes in design studio, you might get, your professors might say that you're sort of imitating something and not innovating. It's very hard to innovate. It's extremely hard to innovate. A lot of times we do something like move incrementally from one style to another because it's so difficult to innovate. But we said that the Georgian forms were, they were like Georgian forms, but the Federal was taller and more slender. And there was a particular use of circular or elliptical forms, especially in windows, doors, projecting porches and fan lights, and we'll see some examples of that. And classical moldings and ornament in low relief versus high relief. I don't know if you remember the difference, but high relief sculpture is very deep. Like we saw one last week over top of a door, it was really carved, that would be high relief. And then low relief, we'll see some examples of, which is very dainty and very, only maybe an eighth of an inch deep. Okay. So here is one of the most famous public buildings. There's only going to be a few architects that we're going to memorize as we go along through the class. This is one of them. This is Charles Bulfinch. Okay, this is the Massachusetts State House in Boston, Massachusetts. And what do you see there? You see the characteristics of the style, which are a temple front, portico, which is an outdoor open area. You see a dome, which we saw a dome on the Pantheon in Paris last week. And you see a symmetrical facade. The center line of the facade runs right down the middle, and this becomes a model for the U.S. Capitol, in addition to the other things we saw last time, in that there are two chambers, the House and the Senate, or two chambers of government. And this is the reason why in America, state houses usually are symmetrical with two houses, because the outside of the building is expressing the internal workings of the government. So you have the two chambers of the State House. Okay. This is a typical meeting house. This is in Lancaster, Massachusetts. And you can see that there's very little change from the Georgian on this one, except that the proportions are much more slender here on the porch. You can see how tall. And if you remember, these are called pilasters. These are pilasters, okay? And there's our pediment. The floor plans were very symmetrical. We have contrasting circular and elliptical shapes. Materials were brick and wood. Should have a clock on this one too. Now this is another building by Charles Bulfinch. And this one has many, many aspects of the style. Okay. One we want to talk about is, you remember on all of the houses and buildings we saw before, they were always a symmetrical facade, and then the whole building was symmetrical. And this is, in the Federal period, they start to have a symmetrical facade, but look, they're actually having asymmetrical floor plans. So they're building onto backs and sides. So even though it looks symmetrical from the front, the floor plan is not symmetrical. Okay? It's austere. It's rectangular block form. You have the fan light over the door. That's called a fan light. And then you have side lights. You can still find lots of homes in America with a fan light and a side light, especially on the East Coast. Does anyone remember what this window is called? Anybody remember that? Palladium. Okay, that's a palladium window, which is a famous kind of window. Here's another fan light here. This is the string course we learned last time. And I want to point out that the floors of the building get smaller as you get higher, and the more formal, you can tell that the lower level is the more formal because it's tallest, and then they get smaller as you get to the top. Okay, so those are important characteristics. And by that I mean all those things I just said on the test. This is a really good example of the kinds of things that they're going to want you to know. Okay. So another thing. This is the Harrison Gray Otis house. Okay. This one is inside the house, and this is the dining room. And here are some other important characteristics. First of all, it is a dining room. And up to this point, there were very few dining rooms in the New World. Look at the size of the table. America is changing, and people are actually having big dinner parties and society, and this is a whole new thing. To have a dining room and look at the floor, it's a wall-to-wall carpet. You have your wall-to-wall carpet in your dining room, and then you have another carpet here to catch the crumbs off the table. Right? So you actually have two levels of carpet. Okay. Now, what do we see here? Remember all that paneling before that was around the fireplace? All the paneling is gone. What you get is you get a wainscot, which is the wooden area here, and you get a chair rail, and you get a baseboard, and you get crown molding, and you now have wallpaper in a Federal-inspired motif that goes around the top to accentuate the crown molding. So the composition of a typical interior wall is baseboard, wainscot, which can also be called dado, plaster wall, and crown molding. So you don't have any of that paneling anymore, all that's gone. Okay, the fireplace, remember last time we had a really big fireplace, then we had this overmantel with a broken pediment and all that's gone. This is a very plain rectilinear fireplace, and this is low relief carving. So low relief carving is here also above the doors. And what that means is low relief is usually, low relief usually means that it protrudes, but it doesn't undercut back. So it's very low carving. Okay? So this piece of furniture is called a sideboard. And one thing that's really cool, if you go to some of these houses on the East Coast and you take the tours, you see these funny little boxes. And these are knife boxes. And they had to always lock up the knives because they were so valuable. So you'll see these little boxes, and when the lid lifts up, it's a strange little thing, the lid lifts up and you see the knives in the box. So that's a knife box. It's a typical interior innovation of the time. And then just to point out that the curtains, this is the typical window treatment, which is actually a festooned curtain, and it would have just a plain panel behind it or just the festooned curtain. Now, remember last time how all the fabrics matched? The fabrics don't match anymore. This one is different from this one, is different from this one, so no more matching fabrics in the Federal period. And just pointing out that there's a rigid verticality about the whole thing. Rigid verticality. And you notice that you no longer have cabriole legs with a claw and ball foot, with a big, circular cabriole leg. It's a straight leg chair. So it's all very formal and sort of classical. Okay? So this house, Gardner Pingree House in Salem, Massachusetts, it's funny. This is we see the typical square, austere, severe exterior. We have flat white lintels. We have a fan light over the door. Here's our fan light and our side lights. We have a semicircular projecting porch. This is typical of the Federal period. Semicircular projecting porch, fan light over the window, slender columns, brick construction, lintel with keystone. The balustrade hides the low-pitched roof, and it's very symmetrical facade. Oh, here you see the fan light with the side lights and the very tall columns. Often house in Washington, D.C. is like that. It's extremely beautiful. Okay. So this is the inside. This is the parlor of that house. And you see the some of the motifs. This is a flower basket motif. That's one of the motifs. This is a sewing table, and it's got like a hanging fabric bottom, and you put your sewing in there when you weren't doing it. You could also use it to store your scissors, your thread, or other little things. This is called a Martha Washington chair. Martha Washington chair, the other word for it is lolling chair. The lolling chair has wooden arms, but it has an upholstered tall back. There you see again the wall-to-wall carpet, which is in a flowered geometric pattern, and that's very important to the room. And the chair styles, this is typical of American Federal chair. You can look at several American Federal chairs, but these were based on the White chairs of England, but these are American Federal chairs. And then you see here the china on the mantle, because they started doing some trade with China, and they're starting to import porcelain. And as you see, the textiles no longer match. And the ceiling is plain. That became the fashion. You go into all of these federal buildings and the ceilings are always plain. Okay, there's no paneling. It's all, as we said, there's a wainscot. Some people say wainscot in different parts of the country, and both are correct. Wainscot and plastered wall. That's painted. These are classic images of the typical, all your lessons are in these couple of pictures. Okay, so here are a couple outdoor shots of Old Town Alexandria, where I went to graduate school. And this is a typical house on the street I would pass. And these houses are typically 12 feet wide. Only 12, 13, 14 feet wide, sometimes 16 feet wide. So when I said the scale was very small, that's what I meant. Very narrow houses. And then this would have been a little bit more elaborate house. Okay, this is one of the most fabulous buildings in the world. If you ever get a chance to go to Charlottesville, Virginia, go to Monticello, which is, Monticello means little hill. And this is Thomas Jefferson's house that he designed. You probably studied this in art history before. This is the rear elevation. The back was all planted. It was a working plantation. This is the floor plan. Here's Thomas Jefferson's bedroom. It's really fascinating. I'll show you a picture. I think I have an extra picture here of Thomas Jefferson's bedroom. Oh, that's the front portico. See the restrained classicism. That's Thomas Jefferson's bedroom. And it's really interesting, and what he did was he built his bed into an alcove in the wall for two reasons. One was when the wind came in through the windows. As you know, when the wind goes through like a tight space, it accelerates. It accelerates and makes it faster. So by putting his bed in a smaller, tighter space, the wind would pass through there and go faster and pull him off in the summertime. And he also would wake up in the morning and he would decide whether he wanted to go to work privately in his library or whether he wanted to go out into the world and manage his farm and so on. So the expression of what side of the bed did you get up on in his case was really true. He just, he depending on what he wanted to do that day first, he decided what side of the bed he was going to get up on. So, and he invented this chair. He invented a lot of furniture. It was extremely clever. And there's this chair. That's his office. And he actually had a ottoman to put his feet on. Oh, he invented the first copy machine. I don't know if you knew that, but they wrote with quill, pen, and ink. And he had like a little device that went over to another pen underneath. And when he'd write the letter, like to George Washington, say, "Dear George," and then the other pen on the other piece of paper would write at the same time. It was like the first copy machine. This is a very interesting time in the history of the world. So this is a house in Charleston, South Carolina, and I wish we had one. I'd like to show you one in Charleston, South Carolina. Lots of the houses in Charleston are all, I think I was explained to you, they're all open on the side. They have open porches where you can walk back and forth. This is one that's not that way, but this is for the purpose of the federal period. So they're showing you the fan light over the entry door. They're showing you the tall, look at the tall double hung windows. Why do you think the windows are so tall in Charleston, South Carolina? Because it's like hot and humid and want to get that hot air to rise in the room. Brick construction. Here we have our balustrade again. Everybody's right in style. You know, their peers up in Boston. Okay. So the interiors. We mentioned that Robert Adam was a famous, he was actually Scottish interior designer in Great Britain, and that his specialty was neoclassical interiors. And but in the New World, they were modeled on Robert Adam, but they were smaller, more simply decorated, with fewer colors. Our interiors were elegant, refined, and formal, with classical elements and motifs, and there were bright, clear colors. We're starting to see that a little bit in some of the pictures we've seen. Bright, clear colors. And now there were more textiles in the New World because guess what was happening in England? We were starting to industrialize, be able to make carpet by machine instead of just by hand woven anymore. So you start to have more and more textiles, and some of the things you had was, there we see it, the wall-to-wall carpet, window treatments, and bed hangings. And the way that the style spreads throughout the colonies are through pattern books, fashion periodicals, immigrant craftsmen, just like before, cabinet makers and upholsterers, and of course imported furnishings and finishing from England and France primarily. And we saw this, rooms are used as they were before, except for the main exception, which is dining rooms. Dining rooms really start coming into their own as rooms in the U.S. And here we have, in Richmond, Virginia, the Wickham Valentine House. And this is exactly what we saw before. The curving stair is typical of Federal period. And not only is the stair curving, but the whole room is curving. Okay? We didn't see any curving rooms before. And this is a gas lamp fixture. These stairs are just incredibly beautiful. Really take a lot of technical experience to build a stair like this out of wood. Common floor treatments are wood, carpet, floor cloths, and no more brick and stone. This is really, almost all of these buildings, when you go in, they're wood, or they have carpet, or they have a floor cloth. And here is a good example. I talked to you last time about Toile de Jouy. This is an example of Toile de Jouy. And Jouy was a town in France where they made this. And in fact, it was very popular with the French court, and that's the reason why. What did I just do? I shouldn't have clicked that, right? Okay, Toile de Jouy was a town. Jouy was a town in France. And who is this right here? This is like George Washington, and this is like Liberty with a shield, and she's leading, the fight against England. And so this is starts to be like a typical motif in American decorative arts and furnishings. And then this is called, and this is always on the test, the argand lamp. The argand lamp was a very big innovation because you put whale oil in the top, and then the whale oil went down a tube and came into the lamp, and there was a wick. And what you got was, instead of the candle power of one candle, you got 6 to 8. So all of a sudden, your dining room was 6 or 8 times as bright for every argon lamp that you had, and that really changed the interiors. Okay. So, furnishings and decorative arts. We mentioned that Robert Adam was the interior designer, and he was bringing the Hepplewhite, the Sheraton styles from England, and then there was also a little bit of the Louis XVI that we saw last time that's also coming. We have national symbols to establish and maintain our cultural identity here, the eagle and the patriots and the shields and stars. We have a lighter scale and slender proportions. The legs of the chairs and tables are straight and usually tapering, so you don't have any more cabriolets. And then you have reading, fluting, spade or thimble feet in contrasts of circles and rectangles. We're going to see some nice example of that. We have wood veneers, marquetry, inlay of classical and national motifs. And then the thing that's really new is you start to have innovations. We saw Thomas Jefferson's tables, innovations in work and sewing tables, knife tables, cellarettes, knife boxes. We saw the knife box, large dining tables, and lots of card tables. And you have less and less differentiation by the end of the period in regional differences like between the Germans and the French. Okay, this is, I mentioned George Hepplewhite's cabinet upholsterer's guide. This is an image of the book that they would have been using in the cabinet shops in America, in Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, to make furniture. And after George Hepplewhite died, in those days, when someone died, there wasn't Social Security, and lots of widows were left and had absolutely no money at all. So when her husband died, and he was a cabinet maker in England, in order to support herself, Mrs. Hepplewhite was very smart, and she actually published a manual of his techniques, and that's how she supported herself, because it got printed and sold over and over again, hundreds of copies in the New World, and so that's how a lot of these styles were passed on. Okay, so here's some examples of various wood inlays. And this is an example of stringing. Stringing is usually a white trim that can be around edge or cabinet or whatever, and then this is like an inlay. Okay, so these are examples of wood inlays and stringing. They're quite beautiful. So this is also American Federal chair, and it has a heart-shaped back, which is actually composed of 3 loops. 1 loop, 2 loop, 3 loop. And it forms a heart. And these loops meet in this little shell design, also called a patera or patere. Patere, I think, is a singular, patera is the plural. And the patra was a drinking vessel in ancient Rome, and just that you held with your hand. So we'll see lots of examples of that. Okay, what you see here is a little inlay on the back. You see carved, it's flat. You see a serpentine front on the chair now, and look at how simple the legs are. The floral motif in the seat is called a bellflower. So that's a typical decoration. Notice how the seat is a plain fabric, so that if you have a chair like this, of exquisite detail, the last thing you'd want to do is put a busy fabric on it, right? So it doesn't detract from the carving. Has anyone ever seen an old chair taken apart? Do you know what they use to stuff these, upholster these? Horsehair. Chairs were all upholstered with horsehair. I can never remember. I mean, the first time I pulled apart my grandmother's old outdoor couch or whatever, and I saw this horsehair, and I was just horrified. Horsehair? What in the world is it? Now I'm more used to it, but you should know that before you had synthetics, they used horsehair to upholster furniture. Okay. So here's another typical American Federal chair, and it actually has a shield back, and that shield back is representing, you saw Liberty with a shield, it's representing the War of 1812. This one's actually 1800, so it's a little bit before the War of 1812, but anyway, the struggle between England and New World. And you see tapered, influted leg, which is typical, and a spade foot. The spade foot was very typical of Federal style. You actually had little, brads here that they might have been gilded. Delicately curved arms, a flute on the arm, just like the columns, the flute, and holstered chair, holstered chair. And notice there's no fancy cabriole leg, there's no fancy ball and claw foot. Okay. So one of the most wealthy families in the New World were the DuPonts. And this is the DuPont, the Duncan Phyfe room in the Winterthur Museum. Duncan Phyfe was one of the most famous cabinet makers in the New World. And if you go to Wilmington, Delaware, you can go to the Winterthur Museum, which is the home of the DuPonts, and you can see this room. And what they've done is they've gotten all this Duncan Phyfe furniture in one room. And this Duncan Phyfe furniture is worth a fortune. And I do mean a fortune. I mean, the chairs, I don't know, I'm going to guess like $20,000 or $30,000 a chair. Okay, so it's extremely valuable. He was the most respected cabinet maker in New York during the period. So, what you see is one of the primary things you see here is the variety of all the card tables. There was starting to be a wider variety of furniture, in particular the card tables. So we saw a test question and it said, what was the furniture that was in the most variety in the Federal period you could choose? Card table. and also, if you saw a test question and it said, what was the most typical form of seating in the Federal period, you'd say chair. Because there were a few settees, but really, everyone sat on chairs. Okay. Now here is an example of a sofa, and look at the sofa. It's made by Duncan Phyfe. This is the only example we have of a gilded foot, because we learned about ormolu last time, which was brass covered with gold, but there is no ormolu in the Federal period. This is one of the only examples. Okay, so you won't see any of this gilding. But look at the simple forms, the fluting, and the bolster pillow, and this delicate, refined, classical shape, and the fabric for the first time is stripes. We're starting to have stripes. That's a characteristic American style. I mean, they had stripes in France and England, but this is the first time stripes really become part of the American fabric sort of lexicon. Okay, it's lighter in scale than European furniture. It's less ornamented, and it often has national symbols like eagles. Okay, so that's a sofa by Duncan Phyfe. Here's a chest of drawers in the American Federal style. The woods used in American Federal were mahogany, cherry, and satinwood. This is a mahogany chest with a satinwood inlay. You see a fan motif down here. Oval drawer pulls. And the industrialization that was going on in England especially led to new sawing techniques which allowed very thin veneer. So this is a veneer, a thin veneer, which has been applied to the face of that drawer to get that look. So this is a secretary, and one of the main innovations in this period was that women had writing desks for the first time in history. And so a secretary would be a typical type of women's writing desk, very simple feet, glass now. Oval whirlpools, scallop trim on the bottom. And then we see some more silver. I don't think this is quite as beautiful as the polyreal silver we saw last time, but this is later silver. And you notice that all the pots that are hot, like coffee and teapots, have wooden handles, so that when the pot heats up, the metal, you don't burn your hand. So those would be silver, sterling silver. And then this is a typical mirror. We see the eagle, we see the swags. It's sort of a classical person sitting on a rock. Okay, and then our book mentions ingrain carpet and Brussels carpet, but didn't provide you with any pictures. So this is a picture of an ingrain carpet, and it's woven with a coverlet almost, like you could put it on a bed. And then the Brussels carpet actually is a looped pile. So ingrain carpet and Brussels carpet. And then this last slide is just a drawing of the railroad hall in Boston with all of the carpets that are being sold. And you see the carpets have come off the trains and people are buying the carpets for their home in the railroad hall. So, and you can see the gas lamps here and the tall windows that we talked about, the long fashions and what they were wearing. There's a sort of, sometimes when you see the pictures of the furniture, you don't really understand what life was like, but this sort of gives you a little bit better idea. You know, men all had top hats on, and it was just, it's so different from now. Okay, so that's it for American Federal. I think that's the last slide. And we'll actually going back to France again next week. And then we'll start to look at more into Europe next week from now on. This is the last American. Actually, it's not. We're going to do Shakers, and then we're going to do Art Deco. But other than that,